Hey guys, check out what I found. That's funner than it looks. So by and far, the most asked question on this channel is how do you get your video to look so crisp and sharp? What settings do you use for video? So today, that is what we're talking about. What settings do I use to make my M50 footage look so good? That looks like a good location for the next part. So interestingly enough, straight out of the box, I do not like the image from this camera. I had to make a lot of modifications before I got this camera to where I really thought it was giving good results for video. And even though now I think I've pretty much mastered this camera, I think it's very important to know your equipment. And as with any camera, I think you need to change some settings in order to not just get decent or good results, but to get great results out of this camera. First thing you want to do with this camera is you want to set it to manual mode. Now, when you first get it out of the box, it's going to have guided mode on, and so you're going to have to turn that off, and then you want to switch over to manual mode, and that'll allow you to change your settings to get good images out of this camera. It's starting to rain again. It did this in the last video. Third time in the past month that I have had to stop vlogging out in Baga because of rain. Well, this is probably just as good, if not better, of a place to be doing it anyway. Now let's really dive deep into these settings. First setting we're going to change is the picture profile. I do not like the standard Canon picture profile. In fact, I don't like any of the presets how they come. So what I do is I go over to the user settings, I set it to neutral, and then I put my sharpening at 2, my contrast at -4, my saturation at 0, and my color tone at 0. Don't change either of those. And the reason I use those settings without lowering my saturation and without changing my color tone is because I want to have an image that I can upload straight out of camera, because often I don't have the time to color grade my footage, so I'm literally just editing the footage and then uploading it. Now, I do suggest color grading if you have time, but I work a full-time job. This is only a side thing, and it's hard enough to get content out, much less having to color grade every clip. And the biggest benefit of that profile to me is that it helps balance your highlights and your shadows. When you're using a standard profile, I always feel that it's just way too contrasty, and I really don't like this image. The next setting is the AF settings. Now, I've done an entire video on this. I suggest going and checking it out, but in essence, I almost always use single point autofocus unless I'm doing a sit down lock off shot, and then I'll put it on face detect. My ISO I keep as low as possible. Of course, that depends on the different environments. I do a lot of my videos out in broad daylight, and so I try to keep it at 100, but if I have to increase it, I feel like I can go up to 1600 without too much noise, without enough noise to make the footage unusable. Shutter speed, I always double my frame rate. If I'm shooting in 24 frames per second, my shutter speed is at 50, because that's the closest thing to double that I have on this camera. And if I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, I have my shutter speed at 1/25 of a second, and if I'm shooting in 720p at 120, I keep it at 1/250th of a second. I don't do that often, but on occasion, in this video I actually did a couple of times. With frame rate, almost all of my videos actually shot in 24 frames per second. Any live motion I shoot in 24 frames per second. Now, if you're doing live motion movement shots, more of a B-roll, then you can use 30 frames per second, slow it down to 80% speed, and that'll take out some of the micro jitters. So that's something to keep in mind, but in general, I just use 24 frames per second. I only use 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second if I'm doing slow motion. I do not like the way that 60 frames per second looks in live motion, so I would stay away from that because 24 frames per second is going to give you the most cinematic result. Now, my aperture, it all depends on my scenario. Aperture is one thing that will drastically change the look of your film. Now, I usually shoot at the widest aperture that my lens can do, and the reason I do that is not to look more pro. What I'm trying to do is isolate my subject. Whatever you have in focus is going to be more isolated from your background, and so your attention is automatically pulled to the sharpest subject in your video. Now, focal length, this all depends on your lens. Now, in general, I use the kit lens, and that's actually the lens that I'm using right now. It's not the sharpest, but it's still pretty sharp. I mean, we're not talking 1990s or 1970s. This is 2018. Even a cheap lens is pretty sharp these days. And because it's not a super wide lens, it's not going to be soft, wide open like a really cheap wide aperture lens. Now, this just has to do with the image of the camera, and these are the settings that I use all the time. Now, if having a wide aperture, shutter speed double your frame rate, and a really low ISO hasn't gotten the image dark enough in order to expose yourself properly, check out this video I did on a budget ND filter that I use in pretty much all of my videos, and I think that is one of the things that really helps me get more cinematic images, is because I'm able to have a shallower depth of field, which shows that it's a large sensor camera and not something like a GoPro or a point and shoot. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is IS setting. Now, usually because I'm using a lens with IS, I do not use any of the digital IS settings. Now, there's something that I have learned about the digital IS since I made my review and basically wrote it off as useless. And that is that the two modes are made for two different things. If you have an unstabilized lens, putting the enabled mode on will take out the little micro jitters and allow you to do smoother movement shots. I actually did this in a professional gig, and I think that it turned out really well. And then everyone that I've seen has basically written off the enhanced mode, and I figured out that the enhanced mode is basically supposed to be like a tripod mode. If you're shooting something like a wedding or a stand-up interview, what it's made to do is basically lock onto your subject and try and keep that subject where it is in the frame and keep it stable around it. If you try to do movement shots, it really looks bad. But if you're just standing there with a non-moving subject, that is what the enhanced stabilization is actually used for, and it actually does work well. I hope that answers any questions that you've been having about what settings I use. If you still have questions, let me know down in the comments section. I try and answer every single question that comes down there. So hit me up down there if you want to know anything else. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next video.